This means that you, in particular, or every person here, has a soul, and that soul continually goes through several processes until it cleanses itself of all desires or any sort of clinging. Desires basically are a form of clinging to existence. When we cleanse ourselves of this desire, or which, with its inevitable suffering, when we get beyond that, then we are no longer reborn. The soul is reborn because it still has some karma to resolve. That is a synopsis of the classical definition of Buddhism. However, in the Japanese don't believe any of that. Again, that's sort of a...
But they seem to answer it in forms of whatever the soul, it goes to a place where there's reward or punishment.
Yes.
They have that idea?
They have very... That's a nice thing about Buddhism, is there's really no permanent hell. People can be punished in the afterlife, but there's always a second chance. In this way, it's a much nicer religion, or much more user-friendly religion than, say, the Judeo-Christian thing, where we have one chance here in this world, and if we blow it, then it's eternal damnation. And in Buddhism and in Hinduism, you are continually reborn, and eventually everybody works their way out of existence, which would be their nirvana, which would be a state of bliss, one might say, or a state of true enlightenment. However, most Japanese do not believe in this, but they do believe in individual souls, or spirits, and that spirit comes back, and this is why priests like myself do memorial services, and this is why there are funerals and things like that. It's for the deceased soul. However, when you get beyond that, on a more abstract level, I think they generally just don't think about it. They haven't really worked this out, how it really works. But they do believe that the soul keeps coming back. This is why they go and make offerings to the family graves at certain times of the year, usually anniversaries of the person's death. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Islamic.
Yes.
Brushed by it. And
yes.
If there's some of the origin of the Japanese people is in Indonesia, part of which is affected by Islam.
Yes.
I'm curious, is there any significant effect here?
So the question is, any significant effect from Islam on the Japanese people? I would say almost none whatsoever. It is the exact opposite in terms of religion, according to what the Japanese believe. Now, when we think of Islam, the first thing that comes to mind is the extremists and terrorism and things like that. In a way, a simple way of defining these three religions. So you've got Islam, Christianity and Judaism, and Buddhism. Islam, at least in the traditional fundamental, our impression, at least from reading the newspapers, is a very volatile sect. And they, even in the ground level, the non-fundamentalists, it's a very, very hard dogma that they have, and everything that was written in the Quran is true, and you better believe it or you're in trouble. And that is a very hard, in Indonesia, of course, it's a much softer form of Islam, but this kind of religious thinking is totally foreign to the Japanese. Christianity and Judaism is a little softer form of that. And on the other end of this, the exact opposite of Islam would be Buddhism, in which case their opinions don't really matter, dogma is almost irrelevant. The Japanese, in a sense, they have religious feelings, but they have almost no, generally speaking, they have very little religious opinion and or emphasis on beliefs. In my case, I would say I fit in the same category. I have very few of what would be recognized as beliefs, and I believe they are not very important. That is one of my principal beliefs, that my own beliefs are not very important. Well, you probably wouldn't hear that in an Islamic country. I have seen no real influence of any form of Islam on this culture whatsoever. I don't know a single Japanese person who believes in Islam. Yes, sir.
You mentioned contemplation, going through the rituals to become a Buddhist monk. What does one contemplate if one is not contemplating religion?
You mean in the monastery? What do we contemplate when we're meditating? Well, there are two active sects of Zen Buddhism today. In one sect, the Soto sect, they just contemplate their own breath. They don't have abstract thoughts, they don't think about Buddha or savior beings. They merely focus on their own breathing, which is a basic form of meditation anywhere. And through that, they believe they gradually attain enlightenment. The other sect that I'm involved in, which is the Rinzai sect, is we are given what is called koans. A koan is a question or a problem or a puzzle that is given to each monk. And these questions, these koans, have no rational answer. They are used more or less as a crowbar or a device to break the intellect. The intellect, in this case, being defined as our definition of the world. And this sect, the one I'm involved in, is nicknamed the Sudden Enlightenment sect. So they give you these questions that you cannot answer with your rational mind. For example, one that many of you may know is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? That is the kind of question they give you, and when you're meditating, you think about that question or other questions, and several times during the day you will go in and see the Zen master during a very brief interview period, very little conversation. Usually one goes in and bows a few times and faces the master who's right in front of you. There's just two of you alone in this private little room, rather intimidating experience. And first thing you say to him is, the name of my koan is, and then you answer the koan, or you give the best answer you can think of, and then frequently he won't even talk to you. He has a little handbell and he just rings it, which means, very funny, please depart now. And so there's not much of what you would call, in fact there is almost nothing what could be defined as a teaching. He doesn't sit there and tell you, well, this is what I want you to think of nirvana, or this is what the Buddha is, and this is what we're thinking, and this is what I want you to agree with. None of that whatsoever. In fact, this first question usually takes minimum of 3 months, usually a year, 2 years, 10 years to answer. And when one answers all of these questions, there are about 1,700 in official use. First one is always the most difficult. Then you become eligible to receive a license or certification to become a Zen master. So in our sect, in the Rinzai sect, we have these little questions that are very confusing, to say the least. And it takes a long time to answer them properly. And also, answers cannot be given. Yes, you had another question?
Answers cannot be, you're on the track there, and answers cannot be given. Who judges whether you've answered?
Pardon?
How do you judge whether you've answered the question?
Very good question. How do you judge if you've answered? Actually, in most cases, especially with the first koan, when you get past the first koan, then in a way we can say that the first koan is Zen 101, or Buddhism 101. Until you pass that koan, at least in our sect, you really have no idea of what Zen is or what Buddhism is. Until then, when you understand it yourself, when you have your own breakthrough or your own self-realization or your own insight, then everything else is just talking. Everything else is just conversation. And until you have that, then you cannot be, generally are not considered enlightened. So who is to judge? Well, the Zen master is ultimately the judge. But before, particularly with that question, usually you know, well, of course, most people in our sect, which is the Sudden Enlightenment sect, you have a sudden insight and you know if you're right or not. He's merely like the referee or the final judge. He is the